Hey friends, welcome to the You Matter podcast. I'm Shane Stanford, and we have a very special program today we're very excited about. Have you ever thought about the brand of Christianity? Have you ever thought about what exactly that conversation means? We go through faith a lot of times, and I think we get into the habit of thinking that our faith is not about what we project and what we're trying to sell, what we're trying to convince others in, and what we're trying to get them to be a part of, what we believe and how we want to share that, and how we believe that impacts the world. And for a lot of us, we have realized that the reason that Christianity has some struggles in very significant places is that it's losing relevance and influence. And part of a brand is not just about selling something, but it's about how people see that brand and how then they respond to what that brand is offering and what that brand is doing. And when we fail to display the promises of Christianity, when we fail to display the full message of Christianity, we know that ultimately there is going to be a sort of an unhealthy view from the world and from others about who we are and what we're doing. Well, my two guests today have written a book about rebranding Christianity, and I remember when this book was being previewed and was about to come out, I was very interested to be able to get this book and to read it, and I think it is a fantastic read. You ought to get it. It's called Rebranding Christianity, and the power of what you're going to hear today is, I think, maybe a conversation that's going to make sense to you. That this is how I felt about the book. The conversation made sense to me, but yet in some ways felt very foreign as I thought about it and as I talked about it. And I think that's a lot of what the book is trying to address. So help me welcome today Jeff Jones, who is a pastor and co-author, and Mike Hogan, who is with us as one of the co-authors. Gentlemen, welcome to the You Matter podcast.
Thanks so much, Shane. Been looking forward to getting to know you and being on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to start pretty basic here. What caused you to want to write this book? Because it does have a unique and new kind of feel to it, although I know a lot of what you talk about are old problems that we've faced for millennia now when it comes to Christianity. But what made you want to write this book?
Yeah, I think I'll start out. I think for me, I am a pastor of a church, and just seeing what's happening sort of on my watch, right, in my leadership era in American Christianity, seeing, I think, in American evangelicalism, so much drift from what I think Jesus called us to be known for, and then realizing we're known for the opposite of that how can I continue? How could I not address that? And then you look at the results too, and, we're in the midst of what some call the great de-churching. Over the last few decades, 40 million Americans have walked away from Christianity, especially in emerging generations, and, just one statistic, and then that's all, I won't go crazy on statistics, but one that really stuck out to me is Gallup did a study in 2001 of people in that 20-something age group. So that was, 20, just a little over 20 years ago, 60%, whether they were Christian or not, 60% had a positive view of Christianity. When they did the same study, different people, right, but same age group 20 years later in 2021, only 37% had a positive view. 63% felt like Christianity was a net negative. Well, that's massive, shift. And it's happening on my watch, so to speak. So it's like, well, something's wrong, and we've got to do something about it.
If that's a business, that's a generational shutdown. That's 20 years later, it's not functioning. So, Mike, what about you? What caused you to be a part of this?
Yeah, so it's funny. So not being a pastor, I tend to encounter this differently, more through sort of the business world side. But I see the same thing, and you'll note that there's a third author, a co-author of the book, Dwight Houston, and so the book really sort of grew out of a series of dinners that the three of us had, and it's interesting, by the way, because Dwight in particular is someone who would not identify as a Christian, who happens to live in a very blue state up in the Pacific Northwest. So he comes at it from a very different perspective. But he and I had observed in our work with a lot of the world's biggest brands, And we've noticed a parallel there. We've all can think of examples of brands that have declined over that used to be very well respected and aren't anymore. They declined for one reason or another. And I think as we started looking into it in the conversation, we decided on this approach because I think from our perspective, it's not that Christianity is losing relevance, right? It's not that the message isn't the right message and we need a new campaign, we need a new advertising or whatever. It's what we found, and we find this when we deal with brands, that they have a very strong promise, but over time, the people responsible for the brand lose track of that, right? And they stop delivering on the promise, right? They get their food gets bad, or they get bad customer service, or they take their price too high, or all these kind of things. And I think it was we looked at the church and Christianity, we said, there's nothing wrong with the promise. This is the same brand that was around 2,000 years ago. What's different is we, as the representatives of the brand, aren't living it. And I think from our perspective, I would say the core message of the book is really that we as Christians are each representative of the brand, kind of whether you like it or not, every day of your life in every place that you happen to be.
But I mean, that in itself is a powerful conversation about how just the three of you came together. What was the glue that brought you together around these conversations you were having that became the book?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I was having the concern. I didn't necessarily think of it as a brand yet, but just seeing the decline of reputation of Christianity in my community. We're a church built around reaching people who don't go to church. And so if you're increasingly seen as repulsive, then, well, that's a problem. So what's going wrong? And I knew Mike is a volunteer member of our executive team on our church. He ran marketing for Frito-Lay and other brands. And so we had conversations, and Dwight Jewson is one of the top branding experts in the world, and that Mike's worked with in various ways and over the years in his companies with PepsiCo and so on. And so so he offered, hey, if I think Dwight might be open to conversation about this issue. And so, Mike, you can maybe tell the story of Dwight from there, but Dwight is really the one who, once he understood what we were trying to do, I was just thinking, hey, in Dallas, in our own area, how can we do this? How can we change the reputation of Christianity in our own area of those two or three people outside of Christianity? And Dwight's really the one who said, why are we just thinking Dallas? Why not think America? This is because he does national branding, It's like, well, okay. And then it was really through him that he nudged to write the book. But Dwight, Mike, you can tell the Dwight story.
Yeah, and I think if you wind back to sort of the very first conversation, Dwight and I had worked together for a lot of years, and so I reached out to him and said, hey, I'm doing some work at my church here, and it'd be interesting if you could engage in this. And of course, he said, oh, well, sure, I'd be happy to, whatever, as a friend or whatever. And I think it wasn't until later on, so he came and met Jeff and had the chance to hear the message as Jeff was articulating it from our church. We didn't find this out until later, but what Dwight said to me later and to Jeff was, hey, originally, I was kind of saying yes as a friend, but I wasn't really sure that I could in good conscience work with you guys, because his perception was, hey, this is an evangelical church based in Texas. They probably don't believe any of the same things that I believe, and they're, angry, intolerant, and all of the various, adjectives, negative adjectives that you might hear applied to the church, particularly the evangelical church. Once he had a chance to sit down with Jeff, he of course walked away with a very, very different perspective. And out of that grew the, hey, you guys may not realize just how negatively your brand is viewed in some parts of the country, and what could we possibly do to get the word out? And like, he called up one day and said, hey, I had a dinner with some friends up in Seattle, and said, hey, there's the church an evangelical church down in Dallas, and they're talking about, serving the community and how can we do things that use our power on behalf of people who don't have any power. And he said, I could hardly get people to believe me that there was a Christian church that could be saying something like this. So that was really the impetus, I think, for us is really being hit with the stark reality of where we were versus where the broad perception is. So from that, I think the challenge to us, coming from somebody, Dwight, from a very, very different perspective, was I don't think we had really connected the dots on just how differently we saw the world versus so many people, particularly in other parts of the country, and what their perception of the brand was. And I think Dwight's challenge was, you guys are doing an awful lot in your own community, and Chase Oaks Church is doing a lot of good things, but you really should be thinking bigger. You should really be thinking about nationally, how do you get this message out more broadly? And so that's what led to the book, and then ultimately the book led to a podcast and so on.
Jeff, how difficult was it though? Because you're in a pretty strong area of the Bible Belt, if we want to use the air quotes, and a great church. I know Chase Oaks, and was that a difficult transition because you're in a very different type of community than say Portland, Oregon, or because that's where our team member, head of our publishing unit, that's where he lives, and we get all kinds of stories. Did you find this understanding of brand being national? That conversation, was there any pushback, or was there anything you saw that was eye-opening to you? What about that?
Yeah, it has been a unique journey in a place like Dallas with a very strong subculture of Christianity that I think is, part good and part really unhealthy. And so I've been, labeled a long time ago as sort of suspect. We're a church that is a very externally focused church that is built around people who don't go to church. And so I'm really not here to keep the Christian subculture happy. I'm here to reach people that don't know Jesus and to endear our culture to God by the way we do good works, like he said, And so that was our focus, and it just, and it's not always understood and celebrated in this particular subculture. But what I have seen is that, Dallas is so diverse now. There's people, it's a melting pot, right? People come in from California and New York and all that. There's really not many people who are from here. So increasingly, we're focused on reaching people who really aren't going to be bothered, if that makes sense, who see the problem. And in fact, what I've seen is that the most enthusiastic people about the book, certainly are Christians who see the problem and see, okay, wait, we talked about what the brand is, but okay, if this is what Jesus says we're to be known and we're known for the opposite, we see it, we've got a problem. But the most enthusiastic people I've talked to are actually non-Christians who've gotten a hold of the book. And it gives hope that, maybe I've judged church too harshly, maybe it's kind of like, I know you stink. I didn't know you knew you stink, and that you would admit it and talk about it, because Christians are always the perfect ones, and so it's been well received by certainly non-Christians in our area and people a little disillusioned with Christianity, but certainly some on the far Christian right get defensive and, it's not our problem. We're great. We're misunderstood and misconstrued, and bad media is out to get us. And so there's some of that.
How have people in your congregation dealt with the book? How have they received the book?
Yeah, it's been very galvanizing for our church. So because and the way people have said it is, they're at our church for a reason. We are a kind of church that's externally focused and so on, but it's given verbiage for people, the book has, to say, and this is the most common thing, is that right now the voices that are out there tend to be from the extremes. At least those are the ones who get the attention, and social media is built for that. So whether it's extreme on this side or that side, there's really nobody speaking kind of in a middle way. And so what people have said a lot is, it's been so helpful to have a strong perspective in in kind of that middle space where you're willing to listen to each other and see difference of opinion as a good thing, not a bad thing. And that, it's just given strength and confidence to say, man, that I felt like what you're saying was, I sort of felt the things you're saying. I just hadn't articulated them. So it's been very unifying and galvanizing for our church.
Well, let's talk about the meat of the book and what you learned. What were some of the key principles that you learned in writing the book and in doing this work?
The brand, I think, is helpful to just make sure we're clear when we say that, because we've been talking about it, but it really goes back. Jesus talked about it several ways, but my favorite is in the New Command in the Last Supper when he's meeting with his disciples. It's that last conversation, and he said, "There's a new command that I'm giving you." And the way he set up the conversation was unique, because the word for new was a word that means novel, never before heard. The way he sets up the structure is he puts it right in the beginning, which is in the Greek way, it was a way of putting neon lights around it that are flashing. So new command, here we go. And here it is: love people the way I've loved you. That's the way people will know you're my disciples, if you love one another the way I've loved you. So it's this radical new command that they don't understand how radical it is, right? Because Peter immediately just sort of ignores it and says, "Hey, wait a minute, that's cute, but you said you're going somewhere. I don't know where you're going. Can we talk about that?" In John 15, Jesus has to come back to it at the end of the conversation. And, because to make sure, hey, you don't get it, but this is the thing. Like this is if we're going to do one thing, this is the thing. This is what we should be known for.
Yeah.
And eventually they got it. And so for what when it comes down to it, what is the new command? It's because loving people wasn't new. Old Testament tells us to love people. Jesus had certainly upgraded that in the Sermon on the Mount to say even loving our enemies, not just those who love us. So that was new. So what's new about the new command? And it's as I have loved you. So it's a Jesus level love that the world had never seen before. And that's the way we should be known. So the first thing that a person outside of Christianity, when they think of Christian, should be, what we should be known for is that, to think, wow, I don't understand what these people believe, but they are amazing people. Like who's that loving? Who's that forgiving? Who's that gracious? Who's that humble? Who listens like they do? Who honors people like they do? That's the way we should be known. Who's that generous? Who's that radically generous? Who's that self-sacrificing? And of course, we don't have to guess how we're known, because there's all these polls and all that Gallup and Barna and Pew do to talk about, well, how do people view Christianity? And the words. I mean, you could guess, right? The words are things like judgmental and arrogant and pushy and mean, and the opposite of the brand. And so the problem is a really deep problem. I think what I've learned, one of the big things I've learned, is we've tried to flip the script in our own area, is how easy it is to surprise people who have such low expectations of us. That's the good news, right? You really don't have to do much for people to think, wait a minute, you're actually decent people, So I think just by doubling down on who Jesus called us to be, I think we'd be surprised how quickly we could gain positive attention and endear people to Jesus and his message. So that's certainly been a learning for me.
I don't know if you know much about our ministry, but what we are doing is we have a journey with Jesus through the year curriculum that we developed. And we've been surprised at how hard it is to get pastors to want to just study Jesus for a year. And they'll maybe 90 days, they'll see how it goes. But it's been interesting how we talk about Jesus, and yet when it means actually following Jesus, we found pastors and churches respond very differently when it comes right down to nuts and bolts things. Did y'all find any surprises? I know, yeah, of course you did. You found lots of surprises in this book, if you're being honest the way it read. But was there anything in particular that you discovered that really was sort of the game changer for you, or that you went, oh my goodness, look at this. I can't believe this is a real statistic kind of deal.
One of the things that I think was I'll say a bit of a surprise. I think at the beginning we had a lot of conversations around, who is the audience for this book, right? And I think we had our suspicions, but I think one of the things, and Jeff sort of alluded to this earlier, is that there's been a number of people from different backgrounds or frankly, faith backgrounds or whatever, they've reacted positively. But I think if there was one really pleasant surprise, it was how positively and almost universally positively people who are not really churched people have responded to this. And I think what it says, I think what it says for me, if I think about it from a brand perspective, one of the messages we do brand consulting, we're always telling people is you got to listen to your customer. You got to listen to your customer. And I apologize to anybody who objects to my using the word customer, but I mean it in the best possible way here. But um, you know, because what you find is like Jeff said before, people know there's a problem oftentimes before the people who are responsible for the brand are willing to admit to themselves they have a problem. And so I think what was refreshing, and Jeff talking about low expectations, is just the fact of somebody in the church world coming out and saying, the truth is we haven't been doing what we should be doing. We're supposed to be the most loving people on the planet, and not only are we not that, but we're kind of the opposite of that. And I think it just the positive reaction just to a willingness to listen and a willingness to admit that there's a problem. And then I think the next piece is really connecting that for people to sometimes in the church, we can make philosophical points very well, but the question is, okay, what am I actually going to do about it? And I think the notion of ambassadorship is something that comes out of the book pretty strongly, which is, we're all representatives here. I was actually listening to your podcast the other day, and it happened to be this Robert St. John episode. And thinking, okay, well, here's a person. Okay, what do you do? Well, I run restaurants. Okay, that's a respectable occupation. I run restaurants. But then, stage one was saying, I'm not just going to run restaurants. I'm going to create a space that's very explicitly a space for everyone. And that's really taking ambassadorship. And then step two was then forming, extra table and saying, how can we get together to make a difference for, food pantries and so on. I thought, that to me, it's such a great illustration, because what we're really trying to get down to is for anybody who reads the book or hears the message is not just sort of to agree with it, but to say, okay, given where God's placed me right now, what can I do? And if everybody in the church looked at it the same way as Robert St. John, then we wouldn't have a brand problem, right? Because everybody would be being a great ambassador, and the perception of Christians would be what the brand is supposed to be, as opposed to what it is.
Robert would love you saying that. I'll make sure he knows that you said that, because I told him he's read your book, by the way. He's read Rebranding Christianity. We're in a Friday morning men's study group. I've been for years and years. And Robert has always thought about his experience, his faith playing a very powerful role in how he manages his company, and how he responds to the community. One of the things that I found interesting, one of the questions that came to mind was, where does someone start? Okay, you're either in the pew or you're not in the pew, but yet this has really affected you. What is something that a reader can do in order to put idea to action, like you just said? Because I remember, I'll just tell you guys, I remember when I was a church planter, when I first read Patrick Lencioni, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's a book written to the business world, but Lencioni has a very strong faith background. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is written to the business community, but it really has a lot to do with the team that I'm managing. And I remember implementing that into my own church staff and just being amazed at what a difference that made. I remember thinking, taking an outside resource to be able to do something miraculous in the church, that set me on a road of really looking at some of the issues you guys talk about, and that is the image, how we are responding to our community, how we are using our resources to not just be insulated, but to go out. And I have found the difference in my ministry over the last 20 years has been in this sort of in between land, between the church and the secular world. There's a lot of energy there, but at times both sides are very hesitant to move into that area. So what would you say to that layperson who's reading that, or that reader who's reading your book? What's the first step?
I think the first step is to own the problem and to take responsibility for it. And the New Testament tells us also very practically how we can be part of the solution. But before that, I think if we're trying to rebuild trust with a culture that we're in a whole generation where we've lost trust, I think just saying new and improved is not going to do it. It's not some, we're not talking in Rebranding Christianity about some new slick campaign or whatever. It's just getting back and doing what Jesus told us to do. But I think part of that is owning the problem and just saying, you know what, we have not as Christians been who we're supposed to be.
Jeff, why do you think that's so hard to own the problem, for especially for pastors?
It's a great question. I think in general, just taking responsibility, it's so easy to get defensive and to play the victim. And there's something in our sin nature that, loves it. And as pastors, we have that same sin nature. And it's hard to just say, I'm wrong and I'm sorry. And of course, that's as basic as it gets in our Christianity to get to that point. The only way you can really reconcile anything is to be able to get to that point. And we should be able to get there. We should have the humility to get there. But, you know, I've been on a lot of different kind of podcasts. Yours is very refreshing as a person who's willing to ask a question like that, because I talk to other ones who are so angry and so us versus them. And this is a battle and we can't admit any kind of weakness and we've got to win, and the way to win is to project strength, and admitting that we're broken and that we're messed up is not going to help us.
But Jesus says clearly, if you want to be my follower, you have to deny yourself and take up a cross. Those are two of the least self-focused things that I know of in terms of projecting in the world. Those are some of the most humble things. And Jeff, I know that as a pastor, you've probably had to confront that individual like what you're talking about in your own church. And I know a lot of pastor friends and a lot of people that I'm on just go, well, how do you deal with that person who seems to have gone over the edge in terms of their rationality and their reasonability? What do you say to them about how you deal with those folks, whether it's an uncle at Thanksgiving or the person sitting in the pew 5 pews ahead of you or whatever?
It's a hard area to disciple people in, because there's so much emotion around it. But I do think that we have to I do think we have to have the foul, hey, that's a foul conversation with Christians, and hold each other accountable. Like the tone, for example. And it's not even so much the position that somebody has, but the New Testament talks about so much about the tone of our engagement, of being humble, being respectful, being truthful, not being slanderous. And I do think that we've got to jump on that quickly. Otherwise, it'll spread. It's a leaven that'll spread through the church if you get your tone wrong. And so I'm pretty quick to jump on that whenever I hear that, to say, hey, wait a minute. I understand you believe something strongly. That's fine. But the tone in which you're saying it is, it's counter to the tone that Jesus calls us to engage with. It's not respectful. It's not humble. It's not kind. And even if you're right, whether you're right or not, you're actually wrong in the worst possible way. And one person told me one time that if you have your theology right and you have love wrong, you have the worst kind of theology. But there's no way to actually do that, because love is at the core of it. And so I think calling people back to what's basic and because so many people are getting in our churches are making side things, tertiary things, the main thing. And we're losing the main thing, which is the gospel of grace, right? And so I think I just have to continually call people back to that, hey, what unites us is not what you're talking about. What unites us and what our focus is has got to be the gospel of grace.
That is a wonderful response, and one that I will steal from you and use in a lot of conversations going forward. I think it's a beautiful way to talk about what we should all know as Christians, because it's what you just described is basically what Jesus was trying to teach us and wanting us to take forward. So thank you, Jeff, for that. And we're about at the end of our time. I do want to ask you the one final question that we ask every person that's on the podcast, and that is, where do you think you matter most? Where do you think God has you mattering most right now in your journey, in your life?
For me, I think I'm at, first of all, I'm at a sort of close to retirement stage of life. And I think it changes one's perspective, right, a lot in terms of, what my ambitions these days are mostly ambitions for others, right? Who do I want my kids to be? Wanting to build into my grandkids, wanting to build into the church, and so, I feel like I'm at a point at which God's given me a lifetime of experience, which I can then use to help, aid, mentor, teach, support, whatever others, and probably measuring progress in a very different way. But I would say, for me, I think seeing really excited about work at Chase Oaks and how this book is being translated into how do you create a community locally that's living this out, but also just in terms of, kind of pouring into the lives of my kids and my grandkids.
Yeah, I think right now my favorite two things. My favorite teaching. I am a teacher, but my favorite teaching opportunities. My 3-year-old granddaughter named Eden. That we're just starting to have these conversations every week or so. So that's been amazing. But yeah, I think right now I where God has me and the opportunities and gifting is to create an environment in a church where all kinds of people who feel, many of whom feel like church would be the last place they would find acceptance and grace, can actually be surprised and be able to have a safe place to come and find Jesus and to begin to journey with him. And I just found out yesterday we're doing a baptism this weekend, and I was so excited. I was just so thankful for this that we have a person in our church that is 20 years old who would describe themselves as a gender fluid, and we have a pretty conservative view of sexuality and that kind of thing. But that's not the person getting baptized. The person getting baptized is their friend who came about 6 months ago and who's come to know Jesus and who wants to get baptized this weekend. But the way that happened was the cast, this person I'm talking about, the gender fluid person, was in a college classroom. Teacher was surprised with a comment and said, "It almost sounds like you're a Christian." And they said, "Well, I am a Christian." And the professor was surprised because knowing the gender thing and all of that, and said, which is messed up anyway, said that he would have to think that way. But so, well, okay, that's surprising that you're a Christian. Tell me about that. How have Christians responded to you? And he said, well, I'm in a church that accepts everybody and that gives space to work out struggles like a gender struggle. And I found a lot of help and encouragement in that, as in my relationship with Jesus and in this community. And so another kid in the class who didn't know him came up afterwards and said, or them said, what church is that? I don't have the same, I don't have gender, any kind of thing going on, but I want to go to a church like that. And started going and coming up. So when you think of what matters, I think about people like that who matter so much to God. And if I can create an environment for people who matter to God to find him, I'm all in.
Wow, y'all have given two of the best answers I've heard in all these podcasts I've done. And so thank you. And, to our listeners, this is an amazing book. I recommend it totally, absolutely. I think you will do well to get it because, to me, and talking to the authors here, it feels very existential, what we're talking about, particularly in terms of true impact by the faith in our communities going forward, our modern era and society going forward. There's so much division and brokenness. I can't imagine. I wish this book could have come along 20 years ago to be able to help us how to navigate, but I'm so thankful that you guys did it now. And it really does make a difference when you read this book. It slows you down to think about these issues outside of the storm. And that's one of the things that I can recommend is that I think we all have encountered the issues of this unsettledness of Christianity is the best way to put it, especially over the last 20 years or longer. And I think what you're really experiencing is an identity crisis with the church and with the people of God. And this is one of the books that you can start to heal and address those issues. Rebranding Christianity with Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan and Drew Jewson or Dwight Jewson. I will close by saying this. I think one of the reasons this hit me was, and I don't know if y'all know my story as a hemophiliac and an HIV positive person who found out as a teenager. And when I went into the church, I had to put everything out on the floor. And I watched the church struggle through trying to ordain me, the first church I was appointed to wouldn't take me because of my health. And I got it through a blood transfusion. But just to watch the tension of the church deal with that, I thought, when these other issues hit the table, and they will, boy, they're really going to struggle with this. And so one of the reasons I wish this book would have come along 40 years ago is it would have made my journey a lot easier. At least it would have I could have given people a book to read before they decided to interact with the issues in front of them. So that's how important I think this book is. So thank you guys for doing that. And thank you for being on You Matter.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you.